Hello, hello, everyone. It is Melissa Santana again, your co-host of the Miss Texas Show. As always, super excited to be with you, share information with you, bring you wonderful guests, but you are actually in for another edition of Melissa's Corner. And so, as always, I love to be able to have a chance to bring more awareness, conversation, education on certain topics that are not only near and dear to my heart, but deserve all the awareness that they can, and honestly, all of the preventative efforts that we can give it as well. And so, this month is no different. I want to be able to tell you a little bit more about what is happening, how we can assist, all of those wonderful things. And so, again, I have, as before, some information. And so I want to be able to share that with you today. And so, official introduction. Again, Melissa Santana. Not only am I the co-host of the Miss Texas Show, but I am also a family support specialist. So I do connect families to resources. And so, if I can ever be of assistance with what I share here, or as the family support specialist that I am, I would love to assist. I'm also a bilingual peer education coordinator for Planned Parenthood. And so I also help with services there at the moment, and I do other efforts there. So I also lead a cohort training. And so I'm usually, engaging in things like this. So again, I love to be able to have these, like I said, comprehensive and wonderful conversations around all these different topics. And these are a couple of the things I do. So in case you didn't know those things about me, now you do. If you want to be able to connect because of those things, or if there's any way, like I said, that I can be of assistance, I would always love the opportunity to do that. So always feel free to connect, reach out, anything I can do to help. And so the topic that I want to be able to talk about is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Not sure if you knew, but it is. There's actually a lot of other wonderful things happening this month in April. It's also Poetry Month, Child Abuse Prevention Month, but we are focusing on Sexual Assault Awareness Month. That is actually one of our pillars of our program here at the Miss Texas Show, is that we do interview sexual assault survivors. We advocate for the ending, honestly, of sexual assault in general. We know that sexual assault takes on many forms. We absolutely do not condone it, but also really join the efforts that are being made to advocate against it, but also to support survivors and to really help with the prevention of this kind of violence, because we do believe it is also preventable with the right type of education, with the right type of awareness. But it is also incredibly unfortunate that it even occurs, and we even have to have these conversations. But it is definitely a very important one, a very necessary conversation to have. And so I'm just glad you're here, to be able to learn more about it. And let's talk about it and get into it. So let's start off with a couple facts about sexual violence. Like, let's talk about the prevalence. Like, why is it important? Is it really common? Like, do I really, is it possible that I could know someone that's been affected by sexual assault? I mean, because maybe you haven't, maybe you personally have not, maybe you have. And actually, before we get any further into it, I do want to say that since I am talking about sexual violence, I realize that this may be triggering for some, and a more difficult conversation for others. And so please do what you need for yourself. Take whatever time you need. I don't want this to bring you any discomfort. I do want to be able to bring awareness to this topic, but definitely want to acknowledge that it might not be an easy conversation for everyone. So please do what you need, take care of your needs, but please know that, yes, I am going to have a conversation about sexual assault, sexual violence, and different ways that we could probably assist in that way. So with that being said, 1 in 2 women have actually experienced sexual violence. This, other than rape. So this isn't just rape. This may be other forms of sexual violence that they have experienced. Could be harassment, could be unwanted touches, any of those things. 1 in 2 women will have experienced it. 1 in 5 men have also experienced sexual violence. So men are not far behind in that respect. I mean, we may not talk about it very often in our society that men can experience sexual violence or violence of any kind, but they absolutely do. The other thing is that those numbers might actually be higher. It's just, it might be that not all men are actually reporting. So honestly, these are just numbers that we have based on those who report, something that we'll get into later, but it definitely happens. But speaking of that, fewer than 5% of completed or attempted rapes against college women were reported to law enforcement. So speaking of that, fewer than 5%, let's just think about that. We just said 1 in 2 women will have experienced sexual violence, but fewer than 5% will most likely get reported. So definitely something, to highlight, but also talk about. 1 in 5 women will have experienced completed or attempted rape. So now instead of it just being sexual violence of some kind, 1 in 5 women will have experienced rape. So that is the completed act of it's one form of sexual violence of a different kind, but it is 1 in 5 women will have experienced it. 41% of women report experience of physically aggressive street harassment. So the other thing is that many women, unfortunately, are not able to walk down their streets without being harassed, are not able to go to their workplaces without being harassed. It does happen. And so 41% of the women who have experienced some form of street harassment experienced that it was physically aggressive in nature. So it wasn't just that, somebody just regular catcalling, as one, might mention it, but it was physically aggressive in nature. 1 in 3 women will have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. So unfortunately, women have a 50 to 95% chance of developing post-traumatic stress disorder after being raped, especially because it's usually done by someone they know. Unfortunately, when it comes to boys, 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before the age of 16. So not only is it happening to our males as well, but it's happening early on. So this most likely to have occurred before the age of 16. Only 26.2% of men who experience the child sexual abuse will have most likely disclosed. So even though it's happening to 1 in 6 boys, only 26.2% of them are actually saying something about it. 18% of men reported experiencing verbal street harassment. So they're also getting harassed. Again, women are not the only ones that experience this. Men also experience harassment. For them, it's about 18%, at least that we know of. And nearly 1 in 67 men in the United States have experienced rape or attempted rape. So that also has occurred. Again, it does occur to them also. 67.5 of instances of rape are estimated to go unreported. So fewer than 5% are reported. That means 67.5% of instances of rape are estimated to go unreported. So among college women, 9 out of 10 victims of sexual assault knew the person. So once again, in a lot of these cases, we're seeing that there is familiarity there, but sexual violence does thrive when it's not taken seriously and when victim blaming does go unchecked. So that is why we're having the conversation today. We want to join our voices with all those other voices that are working towards preventing this issue, believing survivors, challenging victim blaming, and respecting the boundaries of survivors and people alike. Honestly, we should all be able to have our boundaries respected. So a little bit about sexual violence, but also in general, when we're talking about sexual assault, sexual violence actually happens in every community. It happens everywhere. It's not like there's these pockets in the country where we're like, sexual violence takes place here. It's really rampant. And that's, it's this kind of place where you can look, and that's where sexual assault takes place. Now it happens in every community. It affects people of all genders, all identities, all ages. It is any type of unwanted sexual contact. As a result, that's why we're saying that can happen anywhere. It includes words, it includes actions, but it is of a sexual nature. That is what makes it sexual type of violence instead of another type of violence. But it also is against a person's will, and it's without their consent. So a person could use force for that, threats, manipulation, coercion to commit sexual violence, but at the end of the day, it is against that person's will. And as a result, that is why it is known as sexual violence. Violence of any kind, something that is unwarranted, something that unfortunately is forceful, and something that the person ultimately did not want, nor did they deserve. And so sexual assault is definitely in that arena. A lot of my information I'm gathering from, a lot of resources that I want to share with you are from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And so feel free to, check them out. Definitely connect with them, whatever, might be useful to you, but definitely take advantage. And so speaking of that, forms of sexual violence, it isn't just, so we do typically hear rape, that is the number one. That's sexual violence. That's pretty much what it is. It's all I ever hear. It's what I've ever seen, but there's so much more. Sexual assault and sexual violence include child sexual assault and incest. Those are forms of sexual violence as well. Sexual assault in a marriage. Sometimes we think that those who are married cannot be raped or they cannot be sexually assaulted. Yes, they can. Just because the individual is married does not mean that consent goes out the window. It's not just implied. Consent should actually be given every single time. And so as a result, that absolutely it falls under the arena of sexual violence. Any unwanted sexual contact, touching, when we said that the harassment was physical in nature, it was physically aggressive, that's sexual violence. violence. Anytime you were touched and you did not want to be touched, that it absolutely falls under that arena. Sexual harassment, as mentioned. So again, at the workplace, this could be, just in your personal, even at home, like just anywhere that you're at, whenever you are sexually harassed, that absolutely falls under the well. So even though that's not the same as rape, it does not mean that it's not a form of sexual violence. Sexual exploitation and sex trafficking absolutely fall under that as well. I know that we also touch on, human trafficking in our show, absolutely, with Eileen being such a champion of that as well. All of these things do fall under sexual violence, absolutely. Exposing private parts, genitals, naked body to anyone, exposing them in general without getting that person's consent, absolutely a form of sexual violence. Masturbating in public. So if this has ever taken place, if a person does that, they are absolutely committing that act of sexual violence. Watching someone else engage in private acts is also a problem. There have been cameras found in Airbnbs, in hotel rooms, and different things. Those are absolutely forms of sexual violence because, again, consent was not given in those cases. People did not even know that cameras were there. So people have absolutely been prosecuted for that because this is a punishable offense. This is absolutely a crime. And honestly, it's very immoral on all counts to even do that. But it's also just, again, it's a violent act that is being committed. And non-consensual image sharing. So it is absolutely okay for two individuals to share images with one another if they want to, of whatever they want to, if it's of their naked bodies, if it's part of their bodies, whatever it may be. But when that image is then shared with others without that person's permission or consent, that is absolutely a form of sexual violence also. And it is definitely something that falls under that arena of sexual assault. So with that being said, who is it that is impacted by all of this that is then taking place? Like we said, 1 in 5 women in the United States have experienced rape or attempted rape at some point. And like we mentioned, 1 in 71 men have experienced rape or attempted rape. So again, it's not just women, but in general, these are the individuals that are experiencing it, and these are the people that are impacted. So we're talking about a very common occurrence that is taking place. I know that I've even learned, I remember when I first started doing a lot of this work, we said that it happens about every 98 seconds. It's gone up to about every 72 seconds. It's like, unfortunately, it's happening all the time as we speak. Most likely someone is experiencing, well, actually, we know, unfortunately, that somebody is experiencing sexual assault of some kind while we're having this conversation, literally while we're sitting here. An estimated 32.3% of multiracial women, 27.5% of American Indian or Alaskan Native women, 21.2% of non-Hispanic Black women, 20.5% of non-Hispanic white women, and 13.6% of Hispanic women were raped during their lifetimes. So as you can see, unfortunately, those percentages are high because, first of all, any percentage over 0 is high to me. So it shouldn't be happening. I just wish, it wasn't happening to anyone. So any number there is high, but we'll see too that when you account for race, it actually gets higher with the, when we look at multiracial, for example, that is the highest amount. So for women who actually identify with more than one race, they actually have one of the highest percentages of those who will experience rape during their lifetime, unfortunately. The other thing is that, like we mentioned when we were talking about the prevalence at the beginning, victims often know the person who sexually assaulted them. Now, mind you, I love using the word survivor for those who have been able to overcome. Want to use the word victim only because I want to honor the research that I am highlighting, but also because when survivors go through the criminal justice system, they are often referred to victims there. So I'm only using that word here for that purpose, but I definitely believe that those who have experienced sexual assaults are absolutely survivors. They're definitely inspiring individuals. They are incredible. They are courageous, and they are definitely not to be looked at as a result of their circumstances whatsoever. But when this has occurred and when they have been targeted, most likely was by someone that they knew. And so nearly 3 out of 4 adolescents who have been sexually assaulted, they were victimized by someone they knew very well, actually. So it's not even just someone like an acquaintance usually perpetrators or those who, or actually not just to use the word perpetrators, but those who commit a sexually violent act are individuals who know an individual. They take advantage of that truth. Actually, I use the word perpetrator a lot in the past and know that that's not necessarily the most accurate term to use. I know usually in law enforcement that's used, so I tend to fall back to that. but we can actually challenge ourselves better to let it be known that it's an individual who's committing a sexually violent act. We needed to encompass that and make sure that we're properly using the right terminology. And so I want to make sure I not only challenge myself, and make sure that we can do that better. But again, in these cases, those who committed those acts knew the person. They took advantage of the trust that was there, the rapport that was in that relationship, and had access to that person as a result. 1/5 who were committed by a family member. So there's no one you probably know better than a family member. And you see them often. When it's a family member, you don't usually escape them. You see them at family gatherings, you see them at events. And so you usually don't know a person any better than someone who's in your family. And you usually would not have a reason to distrust the person who's in your family, usually. But unfortunately, 1/5 of the sexually violent acts that we're talking about were committed by a family member. That's incredibly alarming and just shows how incredibly difficult it is to escape these acts when they happen. And so sometimes when we're, like we said, let's challenge that victim blaming. When we're quick to say that, how could an individual have been assaulted? How could they not know that it was happening, or how could they not have gotten out of it? I mean, when it's family, that is incredibly traumatizing. And not everybody sees that coming, that a family member is going to want to sexually assault me, not something that is running through most people's minds. Rape is often not reported. So another thing that we highlighted that I want to make sure we talk about is that, and I had, as promised at the beginning, said that we would talk more about, rape is definitely often not reported. It's often not reported, and as a result, not convicted. So there are many rapes that go untouched, not even addressed. Honestly, many things do not occur. But let's talk about why. A person may not choose to report to law enforcement or tell anyone about a victimization they experience for many reasons. There's a lot of reasons that go into that. One of which, so some of the most common we'll talk about here, fear of not being believed. There are, in our society, we tend to laugh when people come forward about certain things. I think it may be to make light of the situation, but we tend to minimize other people's experience when we do that. And so we unfortunately are not acknowledging what's happening. And sometimes we don't often, for some, I don't want to say we, for some, it may be that also they may not want to believe it, especially with what I just mentioned. If the sexual assault is happening inside of a family, and we may happen to even know that family member, it is going to be very difficult for us to accept that. So it might be easier to discount that it's happening instead of having to accept that it is taking place. A survivor also knows that. And so it may be difficult for them to want to come forward knowing that other individuals may not believe them, may not support them, or what's worse, actually almost blame them for what's happening. They may ask them some honestly trauma-inducing questions, such as, well, what did you do? Or like, well, how did you get in that situation? Like things like that, when all they're seeking at that moment is just support. It's just support for having the courage to even come forward at all. So fear of not being believed is definitely one, but also fear of retaliation. As we mentioned, a lot of the ways that these sexually violent acts take place is because the individual committing them threatens the person that they are committing the act against. And as a result, that could be very effective, especially if it is a family member. They may threaten to harm other family members. They may threaten to take something away from that person. They may threaten to expose them. It could be any of those things. And the thing is, it's difficult to not believe someone threatening you when they've already harmed you. If they've already done something to damage you and to cause harm to you, and they say that they're going to do more of that, you're most likely going to believe them because they've already shown you that they're capable of pretty hurtful things. And so it's going to be hard for you to discredit that and not believe that they can do more of it. The other thing is that sheer shame or fear of being blamed, as I mentioned earlier, the pressure from others. I mean, that's another reason why they, might not, they might not want to come forward because they're feeling an immense pressure. And instead of it being their decision, it becomes other people's decision. And so I know sometimes we want to help others, but if a person is not ready to report something, we shouldn't push them. We should just honor where they are and support them with whatever decision they make. They already were not able to be given a decision in the moment when they were sexually assaulted. So the least we can do is try to give them some of that decision-making control and power back to them by letting them decide what they want to do. They might also distrust law enforcement. They might not, sometimes if, law enforcement are not trauma informed, they may ask trauma-inducing questions. They may ask things like, well, what happened? Why don't you remember? Why do you seem to not remember these things? Because the other things you've been following me in my corners, when we talk about trauma, when trauma, not only just my corners, but a lot of the guests that come on our show, when we talk about trauma, trauma absolutely affects you. It affects your brain and it causes you to remember things out of order. I mean, it might come back to you misplaced. And so when you're trying to then tell law enforcement about that and tell them, what happened to you, and you're not saying it in a chronological order, they may not believe you. They may think that, okay, this doesn't sound right because it doesn't even seem like you know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, it's actually a very telltale sign that that person absolutely was assaulted because of the fact that they're remembering things out of order. But again, not all law enforcement are aware of that. And honestly, many survivors don't trust that law enforcement are aware of it or may have had negative experiences with law enforcement in the past. Also, a desire to protect the attacker. So the other thing is that, especially if it's a family member, they may actually care. The survivor may actually care about the person who committed the act against them. May want to protect them. But again, they also may not just be protecting them because of the care or concern they have for them. They may want to protect them because of the threats that they said. And so, or they may want to protect them because they don't want them to commit these acts against other people. They may be thinking about so many things that as a result, they don't say anything. They take all of that in and they don't end up saying anything to anyone. And so not only are they being abused, but they're living with the abuse in silence, which is just an incredibly difficult and horrible thing for individuals to have to go through. And that's why I can't have these conversations enough. Because of that, the main thing I want to make sure is echoed, like voiced across the mountains, written on billboards. Victims are never at fault. I know that in our society, we often hear the opposite. It must have been what he or she, what they had on. It must have been how this person was acting. It must have been the nature of their relationship. Absolutely not. Victims are never at fault. Choosing to violate another person is not about drinking too much, not about how much someone has drunk or drank at a party, trying to have a good time, getting carried away. That's such another one. Like, well, didn't mean for it to happen. I was just in the moment. Nor is it about the clothes someone was wearing, how they were acting, or what type of relationship they had. Violating another person is a choice. The person who chooses to do that did choose. And so never, because honestly, if a person is inebriated enough, so let's say that they're drunk, they're not going to actually be able to complete the sexual violent act. They're going to be unable to do so. So whenever drinking is involved, also, there's one person that is more sober than the other when a sexually violent act occurs, and they take advantage of that, to be honest, because again, they would not be able to complete the sexually violent act if they were completely drunk. They wouldn't even be able to do these things. So unfortunately, when drinking is involved, there is one person that is more sober than the other, and they make a choice to commit a sexually violent act against another person. And so saying that it's about drinking too much or getting carried away is absolutely not accurate. And so I'm definitely here to debunk that myth. Victims are definitely never at fault. And saying that they are is not only re-traumatizing them, but honestly, it's something false. It's a lie that we're spreading to blame a victim for having, or a survivor for having endured a sexually violent act. Absolutely not. But there's also, so how is it that other people are then impacted? So the thing is, when these things do happen, there's a lot of impact that occurs. It's not a very simple thing that happens and it's just kind of swept under the rug. What I want to make sure is highlighted today is that this impacts survivors for, time to come. Like, unfortunately, individuals can be affected for their entire lifetimes off of one sexual act. So unfortunately, when it comes, I know I've talked and I plan to talk more in the future about domestic violence and other forms of violence as well. I know by now what I've talked about is teen dating violence up until this point, and I've talked about stalking. And so with teen dating violence, that also, can take on, there could be more than one act that happens when someone is stalked. Usually they're stalked over a period of time. Like, it's not always with sexual violence. Someone it can occur once to a person and still impact them for their entire lifetime, honestly. So some people unfortunately are sexually assaulted more than one time, but there are individuals who are assaulted one time and that one time was enough. I mean, it's still incredibly traumatic. There isn't like a magic number of how many times they need to be assaulted for them to be affected. Any time that they were assaulted and in any way that they were assaulted absolutely matters. And unfortunately, it can absolutely create trauma. So like we mentioned, it's not just rape. It's absolutely not just, some, you know, whatever, or just that act of in sex, just the completion of sex in general. It is the touches that lead up to it. It is the words. It is the harassment they receive. It is any unwanted behavior in general that is sexual. It's any of that. So again, there's many things that encompass it. But as a result, an assault may impact the survivor's daily life no matter when it happened. And so that's the other thing, that it could have occurred when they were a child. It may affect them as they were an adult. It could be opposite, as an adult, it can affect them when they have their own children, or even just as a single individual, just, navigating the world. Each survivor reacts to sexual violence in their own way. Some common reactions are guilt. They feel guilty. They think that they could have prevented it. They think that they should have found a way to get out of it, or that they should have been better off fighting, even though they don't realize that it is absolutely incredibly common to shut down when sexual violence take place, to not even want to, for your body to just, freeze, to be honest, to not have a reaction when you're getting sexually assaulted. A lot of times your body just shuts down. You don't even, you're just so shocked by what is taking place. And unfortunately, you're not able to react the way you would have normally reacted in any other situation. Just like if someone was held at gunpoint, I know that's incredibly traumatizing, but also for some people, it causes them to freeze. I mean, they see the gun, they may want to run, but they get so shocked by it happening that they sometimes are unable to even move. That can absolutely occur during a sexual assault as well. And so, but for some, they absolutely feel guilty because they feel like they should have been able to do more. They're not aware of that. They're hearing all these conflicting messages from others, and so they feel guilty. They also feel ashamed. No one enjoys having been the victim and now a survivor of sexual violence. No one enjoys it. No one asks for these things. Again, that is why I cannot emphasize enough that they are not to blame for these things. And so they definitely feel shame as a result that they unfortunately were the target and recipient of a sexually violent act. They also sometimes are afraid, and so sometimes they live in fear. So now that it's happened to me, will it happen again? Like, what do I need to do now to prevent it? Is it on me? Like, will this always be my life? Some of them feel numb, and honestly, or they might engage in behaviors that continue to allow them to live in that numbness. I don't even want to feel anything anymore. I'm incapable right now of feeling any feelings because, too much. The other one that I mentioned, shock. Some of them go into complete shock. Some of them stay there for quite some time. And a lot of them can honestly feel isolated because, especially when they're not around people that may understand it or may know how to support them properly, they feel very alone. They'll very incredibly alone. So that is why I can't emphasize enough that if a person comes to us and tells us about a sexually violent act that happened to them, the least we can do, very least, is listen, but also believe them and support them, because it took a lot for them to come forward to us. So even if we don't believe them, we should at least act like it. But the unfortunate truth is that a lot of times, individuals may not believe that survivor, and they show it. And so I just think I'd rather you fake it until you make it, even though a survivor most likely can sense that. And so that is another reason why they may feel those feelings of isolation and feeling alone. But I think that I just hope with more of this information, we can challenge why we don't always believe survivors and really work towards believing them, because they deserve that. I mean, it's in, even if a person lies, to be honest, the chances of a person lying, those percentages are very low. And if a person is lying about something like this, it's usually going to come out, like that truth will reveal itself. But I am always going to err on, I'd rather believe someone and have supported them as much as I could versus not have believed them and maybe even caused them to face more trauma or prevented them from being able to get the help that they deserved and wanted, because I wasn't able to support them and because I did not believe them in that moment. I'd rather err on the other side. The other thing is that as far as impact on survivors, the physical impacts, can last as well. These may include physical injuries, because unfortunately some of the violent acts that occurs are violent in nature. They're very aggressive in nature. So they may cause personal injuries. There may be concerns about pregnancy. Unfortunately, when a sexually violent act occurs, that is the concern or risk of pregnancy is definitely going to be present. And so it's a very valid concern that occurs. And that is why when a person is sexually assaulted and they go to the hospital afterward, they may receive a rape kit. in it, there may be medication there to help them to prevent a pregnancy and things like that, like the Plan B pill and things of that nature. These things are given to them because the concern for pregnancy is there, and a person may not want to conceive the child of someone that they were sexually assaulted by. So naturally, concerns are present there, but these resources are then offered to the person. They also may risk contracting a sexually transmitted infection. Unfortunately, usually people, since consent was not given, we unfortunately do not know, the person is not going to know what that person may have. And yeah, they may contract a sexually transmitted infection as a result. But economically, sometimes survivors are also affected economically as well, because it may include medical expenses that they did not expect to have, that now all of a sudden they're required to pay or expected to pay for. It could be also time off work, because now I'm having to, if I do go to report it, I got to take time off work, go to the police station to commit all, like complete all these steps, speak to detectives. Like there's a lot of things that go into it. And honestly, they may need time off work because they've just been traumatized. And so they may not be ready to go back to work right away. And so unfortunately, they're having to use their time up for that. But the long-term psychological effects that a survivor may face if their trauma is left untreated includes post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, isolation, many others. They may find themselves having nightmares after it. That is another very common thing that happens. They may have flashbacks even when they're not sleeping. So nightmares, I mean, that's something that occurs when you're asleep, but you may have flashbacks when you're fully awake, and you may not even be doing anything that necessarily, it could be the simplest thing that unfortunately triggers a memory. And then unfortunately that person is taken right back to the moment when they were assaulted. It could be a smell. It could even be a smell. It could be a certain smell that takes them right back to that place. It could be any of that. That's also why that's an effective tool for law enforcement officers to use, different things like that, because it could be that a person may not remember exactly what they could see, but they may remember what they smelled. They may remember something that was in the background. But also these are things for us to consider when we're thinking about the psychological effects that survivors are having. And so they can really be triggered by many things, and unfortunately face it may definitely have a big impact on their mental health, which understandably so. Now, when it comes to loved ones, though, we may not always think about these things, but survivors are absolutely impacted, but so are their families. So are the ones that care about them. And that's why if I'm speaking to anyone today that may not have personally been affected by sexual violence, but know someone, I also understand that this can be incredibly difficult for you. And so because sexual violence can affect parents, friends, partners, children, spouses, coworkers, anyone, who may have known that person. Unfortunately, we kind of also think, what can we do more? Is there more that we can do? It's hard. Like, what is the right thing to say? How do I support? But also, I wish I could have done something, wish I could have helped prevent this. I feel so incredibly bad that this occurred to someone that I know, that I care about, someone that I love. And so as a person tries to make sense of what happened, loved ones, they may experience similar reactions and feelings. They may also go into shock. They may also feel alone. They may also feel depressed to that person. And like we said, to those of the survivor, they also may feel afraid as well, especially if it's someone they also know. But also just in general, that these kind of things can happen. So now I'm afraid, will it happen to me? They may feel guilty, absolutely, that they may not have been able to do enough for that person. They may also blame themselves and think that, I should have done more. I could have. I just wish I could have, helped prevent it. And as a result, anger. A lot of loved ones may experience anger as a result of it, understandably so. We would never want anyone to then use that anger to do something else negative, like two wrongs they definitely do not make it right. But also, it's just so understandable that anger is going to be experienced by someone nonetheless, just because it is, when something happens to somebody you care about, like there's no right feeling in that moment. What you're feeling, whatever feeling you're feeling is valid. And you're allowed to feel those feelings, even if it's anger, because I can understand why, when you care so deeply about someone, to see them then violated, and and what may feel like on your watch, right, because it was somebody that you knew and you weren't able to do anything to stop it, you might feel angry about that. And that is absolutely valid, understood, and okay to feel those things. But I would definitely encourage anyone who may be impacted or know someone that they should also seek help as well, and they deserve it. It's not just, yes, the focus should absolutely be on the survivor, but you, as someone who cares about them, should make sure that you prioritize your mental health as well. And so definitely something to keep in mind. But also communities at large. So schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, campuses, cultural, religious communities, they may also feel the fear, the anger, the disbelief when something like this happens, especially like we said, yes, because for example, starting with the first one, on school grounds, when we know that it happened with someone that is possibly our classmate, when it's someone that we may have passed in the hallways, that can induce or create a lot of feelings of fear, anger, or disbelief, just because we just couldn't believe that it happens, but also again, like it could have happened to me, when this happens. So we definitely think it does cause a lot of that, a lot of that to then disperse in that community. And so unfortunately for us to feel like, wow, I never realized these things could happen, but also I was this close to it. So I think that's also what occurs. And so whenever we hear about these things happening, that's why I think we should take them seriously, but also we have to acknowledge that it's very impactful. Like it absolutely does impact us, and on a positive and negative level. Well, unfortunately, the only positive I mean is that when it occurs, the fact that we're having conversations about it, that's what I mean by positive. But of course, what I mean is that the impact can absolutely be negative when it takes place. The only positive I'm saying is that because it's never positive that violence happens in our communities, the only positive I have is that we can then help others more, right? We can have more conversations around it, but I absolutely don't think violence in itself is positive. There's nothing positive about it. There's nothing okay about it, but I do think that there's a great value in having conversations about it, raising awareness about it, and trying to prevent it in the future. Violence of all kinds does destroy a sense of safety and trust. There are financial costs to communities, including medical services, criminal justice expenses, crisis and mental health service fees, and the lost contributions of individuals affected by sexual violence. So the fact that those who may, like we said, not be able to go to work, may not be able to perform normally as they would in the past, that impacts the community, when there's, individuals who no longer can contribute to the community the way they did before. And so sexual violence, that's why that's another reason why we're saying that it's incredibly common. Unfortunately, it's incredibly impactful, but also this is why it should matter to us too, because this is what we mean. This is how it can affect us and our community at large. And so this is why, if any of this resonates with you and you're wondering like why, it should matter and why we should do more about it, these are part of the reasons why, why our voice matters in these situations, and why it absolutely is helpful for you to join the voices, should you want to. But now society at large. So we talked about at the individual level, at the more like as we're getting more into the macro, so the micro level and the macro level. And so on society, a recent study actually showed from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that individual victims of sexual violence actually incurred about $122,461 over their lifetime in costs associated with lost wages, health, criminal justice, and property damage. And so again, this could have been one act of sexual violence, and they still could have incurred all of this over their lifetime associated with it. And so, or again, it could have been more than one act that happened, but it's just an incredibly high and unnecessary number that we're seeing right there. They should never have had to pay anything for this. They never should have had to be, unfortunately, the target of this, but unfortunately it happens, right? It does happen. And so that's why I'm glad we're having the conversation about it. Additional research also shows that sexual violence can derail a person's education and employment, resulting in a $241,600 income loss over a lifetime. So it could also be that they lose income, the ability to generate income that they would have, or they're literally having to take on expenses that cost them over the course of their lifetime. Sexual assault and the related trauma response can disrupt survivors' employment in several ways, again, including time off, diminished performance, job loss, inability to work. So it's not just that they may need to take time off work. It's not just that they may be unable to go to work. It can also be that when they're there, they're not able to perform their job duties. It just affects them. And then as a result, they lose their job. Their life is completely, affected and damaged as a result. That is what sexual assault can do. And that is why having conversations about sexual assault and violence in general this is exactly why we have these conversations, because that is the impact. We think that we hear about it, we may, in passing or whatever it may be, but we don't always think about how it can affect the person and affect our society. And so absolutely, this is that impact right here. In 2015, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission alone recovered $164.5 million for workers who are alleging harassment. And so indirect costs for employers do include decreased productivity, higher turnover, and reputation damage. And so those things can absolutely occur as well, because harassment, like a lot of times, does take place in the workplace. And so when those things happen, the company can absolutely, their reputation can absolutely be damaged. But especially when they don't do anything about it, it also depends how a community responds. And so when harassment occurs, the best thing is definitely to have policies in place and to absolutely advocate for those, and or at least allow space for the person to advocate for themselves when harassment has happened, and for there to be certain punishments or consequences. But unfortunately, it definitely can damage the reputation of a company, just the sheer act of it happening. But again, it also matters how those respond. So I just hope that individuals hearing that who may have a company and know that harassment may be taking place at their workplace, do know that they have certain policies in place. And I know that it's something for us to think about, like which kind of organizations do we interact with? How is it that they're responding to it? Or if you've already known something that happens, like, is there a proper protocol for it, and how is it being taken? But when it does happen, it definitely can decrease productivity for people there. A lot of people may want to leave that job once they know that harassment is taking place there, and that can absolutely affect that place of employment and definitely affect our society as a result. So as we mentioned, April is definitely Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It is teal is usually the color, as you're seeing, that is used. There's many events that take place over the course of this month. There is a day where you can actually wear teal in support of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. There are many hashtags that you can use, social media. There are many events, many forums that are taking place. There are many colleges that during this time will put on events, right, in honor of sexual assault awareness. There are, a lot of events, a lot of things that are happening, a lot of conversations taking place. And so it just gives us a platform, because unfortunately, sexual assault doesn't just take place in April. It's just that we're talking about it more in April. And so, this is an opportunity for you to find places to get plugged in. And so if you didn't already know about it being Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April, now you do. And so I'm hoping that you'll join the conversation and join the efforts, or at least just learn more, during your free time if you want. But joining your voice again with other voices, I think is something incredibly powerful that we can do, and can also have a great impact on our communities and society at large. And so with that being said, the best thing we can do is that during this month and always, to support survivors of sexual assault now. And like I said, whenever we can do that in small ways. We can do that in big ways. We can do that by just being supportive, right? I think the first thing we can do is just be supportive in general, believe survivors when they come forward, and just meet them where they are, understand where they may be, not try to, influence our own agenda just because we feel guilty, or just because, we want to help. I mean, those are great intentions, but we want to just meet survivor and honor their process. And again, take care of ourselves in the process as well. So definitely support survivors, not forget about ourselves, but definitely do what we can to help them, especially during this time, but also whenever we can. But this is also giving us a great platform. So how can we support, right? We say that like, oh, cool, so let's support survivors. What is a way to do that? Like, how is it that we can do that? Well, there is a social context that surrounds sexual violence. A lot of why it's perpetrated in our society, a lot of reasons why it continues in our society, is that the social norms that condone violence use power. They use power over others. I actually shared the power and control wheel in my teen dating violence corner. If you haven't checked it out, feel free. And so the power, because in a lot of these violent acts, that is what happens, is that those committing the violent act are absolutely using power and control over the other person. And so they're inflicting that, they're taking advantage of that, especially if they already possess power. But even if they don't, they inflict that power over that person, and they inflict that a sense of control. But usually they do. Usually they hold some form of power over that person, and that's what they take advantage of. But also in the moment, because they're committing a violent act, they tend to overpower the person literally in many different ways, whether that is physically, mentally, emotionally, they tend to overpower the other person. So it is absolutely an act of violence, power and control. And so because in our society, there are norms that condone violence or use power over others, there's also traditional constructs of masculinity. So there's usually like men being more powerful than women. And so the subjugation of women, so us seeing women as sexual objects, and so thinking like it's probably something she did or something that she was wearing, because we don't see women being like, it's not possible for a woman to really be raped, especially if she was married, especially if she was wearing certain things or she was acting in a certain way. And so it makes it easier for silence about violence to continue, and for that abuse to then contribute to the occurrence of sexual violence. We're not talking about it, we're not acknowledging it, and so the violence continues. Oppression in all its forms is also among the root causes of sexual violence. As we mentioned, those multiracial women had the highest percentages of being raped or being the victim of sexual violence. And so unfortunately, they tend to be the ones that are most oppressed. They face a lot of the discrimination in our society. And so, and also for multiracial men, and for multiracial non-binary, for those who are absolutely from the LGBT community, for those who are all of these things. And so definitely any person who finds themselves oppressed or in an oppressive position, definitely that is also the root cause of sexual violence. Usually those who commit these sexually violent acts target those who are oppressed. And so unfortunately, you'll see that definitely takes place there too. And it definitely actually increases those who are from members of those who are part of the LGBT community, LGBT plus, absolutely find themselves to be targeted as a result of that as well. And so you'll see that a lot of that also happens. They are already oppressed in other ways and can find themselves to be the victims of sexually violent acts also. And so, and we just had Transgender Day of Visibility, that was at the end of March. Absolutely. Like there are so many chances to be able to increase this conversation and make sure that we understand that violence of any kind should not be condoned, but it's also violence against any person or any individual. No individual deserves for this to happen to them. All individuals should be able to live safe, secure lives, and should not be targeted for any violent act just because of their identity. So oppression in all its forms, again, is among the root causes of sexual violence. Sexual violence is preventable. It's through collaborations of community members at multiple levels of society, in our home. So it starts with us, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, places where we practice our faith, workplaces, and other settings. So really, I think that we can hopefully come together, even if we don't agree with all of the things taking place in our world. I would hope that violence is one of them that we can all agree we don't want to see happen. And so we should be having more conversations about how we can prevent that from happening. And so we all play a role in preventing sexual violence and establishing norms of respect, safety, equality, and helping other people. Absolutely. And so with that, consent. Consent is definitely something that we can also teach more individuals about, keeping in mind that it is something that is freely given and informed. A person can change their mind at any time. So as I have mentioned many times before, but also during this presentation, consent is never implied. Just because you're married doesn't mean that you're giving consent. Just because you may have given consent to a person on one occasion does not mean you have automatically given them consent on a separate occasion. It needs to be given every single time, 100% of the time. So it's just not part of the time either. It should never be implied. It should always be freely given. And it shouldn't be the result of force either. Like, I did get consent. The person said yes, but how did you force them to give you consent? And so that is also not a form of consent either, if it is by force. And so consent is also more than a yes or no. It is also a dialogue, conversation about desires, needs, level of comfort. So if you are going to engage in a sexual act with someone, that is okay to do, but having a conversation about it not only will ensure that consent has taken place, but also that person is comfortable, that person feels okay and ready to engage in it. And it can lead to the sexual act actually being more enjoyable for both parties involved, because a conversation took place and their boundaries are being honored, their needs and wants and all those things. And so all of those things should definitely be taken into account. the other thing that you can do is share the information that you now know about sexual violence or any other thing that you may learn in the future. Please say that it is never the victim's fault. We definitely encourage that to be the case. At least we can start with that. We can also ask respectful questions about a person's attitude. Why do they feel that way? Maybe having a discussion could change their attitude or belief. So if you encounter a person who feels a certain type of way about sexual violence, maybe asking them, well, why do you feel like that? Do you, especially someone who may blame a victim, you may say, or blame a survivor, well, why do you feel that? I mean, is there anything that made you think that way? Is there, can we have a conversation about it? Like, I would love to learn more about, what it is that you feel and why it is that you feel that way. And so just asking a person how they feel and just being able to have that challenging, thought-provoking, but honest conversation and genuine can help and go a long way. Telling them those comments are not appreciated in your home or in your presence and you would like them to stop. So if a person does, for example, not, like denounces consent or, has negative things to say, telling them that that's not okay and that those comments are not welcomed here. That's why we say it starts in your home. I mean, we know that we can control the society at large and we may not be able to, fix everything all at once, but we can at least tell people, in our presence, in our bubble, and the people that we have access to, that we don't condone it, and that we're not okay with it. These are small things that can make an incredibly big impact just by us doing that, because unfortunately it's us not doing that has allowed violence to continue, because we're not doing that now. We're not we're silently condoning it with our silence. And so by not saying anything, we're allowing it to continue to happen because we're not taking a stand against it. And we're making it seem, we're implying that we're actually okay with it by not saying anything at all. And so that is some of the information. Of course, I could keep you. We could talk about so many other things. I could probably have a whole separate presentation on just trauma, law enforcement, all of those things that we mentioned. But in general, just wanted to be able to get a general sense of what is sexual assault? You know what I mean? How can we prevent sexual assault? Why should we be having the conversation about sexual assault? And the fact that it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Like I said, we join our voices with those who who are joining the fight against sexual violence, who want to raise awareness on sexual violence. And so we want to do that during this month and always, but our show especially does support this notion, all the efforts against violence of any kind, especially sexual assault. And so we definitely wanted to join the conversation. And so we thank you for, engaging with us today, listening to me. If you got to the end here, I give you, I love it. I'm glad you, rocked with me this whole time. But if you also have further questions, right? If you were like, maybe they scratch an itch, or maybe if you also want to have more, like you're thinking, okay, well, now I would like to actually have more conversation about it, or maybe it did bring up a question, it brought up a concern, you can always find me at Santana Says _ on Instagram. So kind of like Simon Says, Santana Says on Instagram there. But you can also follow our show, the Miss Texas Show on Instagram. It is Miss Texas Official. We can also be found on Facebook and all of those things. And so, and if you want to be a guest on our show, you can absolutely reach out to me, reach out to the show, and we can definitely look into making that happen. So again, if anything resonated with you, is there anything you want to connect on, talk further about, please do not hesitate. But also to all survivors, you absolutely did not deserve what happened to you. You absolutely deserve all the support that we can offer you in this world. We definitely at the Miss Texas Show, again, joining that effort. But anyone listening, please know that you can also join as well. But also, I think you're doing already an amazing thing, especially, again, if you engage with me today, then I know that there's a part of you that wants to learn more, wants to do more, may already be doing things. And so I applaud you for that. And I thank you for that. And I just think that there's nothing small that we can do when it comes to these things, when it comes to prevention, when it comes to raising awareness. Everything matters. Everything has value in it. Every effort that we can do is valuable and it's helpful. And so I'm glad that we're doing it. So thank you so much. And I will see you on the next edition of the Miss Texas Show, the next interview, or the next Melissa's Corner. Look forward to talking to you then. And again, thank you all so much as always. And it's always a pleasure.